People say advice gets outdated with age. They say the world moves on, and old men are left behind. My name is Harold Bennett. I'm 61 years old, and this is the story of how my son ignored every piece of old-school wisdom I tried to pass down until one crisis forced him to realize I wasn't stuck in the past. If you enjoy real-life stories like mine, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what happens next. I raised my son, Ethan, to believe in preparation. Not luck. Not shortcuts. Preparation. I taught him how to change a tire before he learned how to drive. How to balance a checkbook before he got his first credit card. How to read people, not just contracts. He used to listen. Somewhere along the way, that changed. Ethan is 32 now. Smart. Ambitious. MBA from a top school. Works in tech finance, where everyone talks fast, dresses sharper than they need to, and believes any problem can be solved with the right app. To him, I'm old school. That's the phrase he used the first time he dismissed my advice outright. "Dad," he said with a laugh one night over dinner, "that stuff worked in your time. Things are different now." Different. I nodded, because arguing only pushed him further away. But inside, something tightened. Not because I felt disrespected, but because I recognized the confidence that comes right before a hard lesson. The first warning sign came when Ethan decided to buy his first house. Not a modest starter home, not something practical. A high-end townhouse in a newly developed area, all glass and steel and promises. The price made my stomach drop. "You sure about this?" I asked carefully. "Have you checked the long-term costs? HOA fees? Property taxes?" He smiled like I'd just told him the earth was flat. "Dad, the market's different now." My advisor ran the numbers. "Your advisor benefits if you buy," I said gently. That earned me a sigh. "You always think everyone's out to get people." "No," I replied. "I think incentives matter." He waved it off. Then there was the job change. Ethan left a stable position to join a flashy startup run by a charismatic CEO with big promises and vague answers. When I asked about contracts, severance, backup plans, he laughed. "You worry too much," he said. "Risk is how you grow. Risk without a net is how you fall," I wanted to say. But I didn't, because every time I opened my mouth, I saw the same look cross his face, the polite patience reserved for someone you believe is behind the times. Still, I couldn't help myself entirely. "Just promise me one thing," I said the last time we talked about it. "Always have an exit plan." He smiled. "I do. I'm young. That's the plan." Weeks passed, then months. Our calls became shorter, less frequent. When I asked how things were going, I got surface-level answers. "Busy. Great. Can't complain." I knew better. You don't avoid questions when things are going well. Then, one evening, my phone rang at 2:17 a.m. I knew something was wrong before I even answered. "Dad," Ethan said, his voice tight and unfamiliar. "Are you awake?" I sat up instantly. "I am now. What happened?" There was a pause. "Too long. I need help," he said quietly. In that moment, every lecture I'd ever held back disappeared. All I heard was my son scared, cornered, finally stripped of certainty. "Where are you?" I asked. "At my place." I don't know what to do." I told him I was on my way. The drive felt endless. Red lights stretched longer than usual. My mind raced, cataloging possibilities the way it always had: financial trouble, legal issues, job collapse. When I arrived, Ethan looked smaller than I remembered. His townhouse was immaculate, but the air inside felt heavy, tense, like it had been holding bad news for days. He handed me his phone without a word. Emails, bank alerts, messages marked urgent. The startup had folded overnight. Accounts frozen. Paychecks withheld. And worse, he'd personally guaranteed a loan he barely understood. trusting a handshake and a reputation instead of reading the fine print. My heart sank. How bad is it? I asked. He swallowed. I could lose everything. The house. My savings. Maybe more. He looked at me then, not defensive, not dismissive, but desperate. I should have listened, he said. I took a slow breath, because this wasn't the moment to say I told you so. This was the moment to prove that wisdom doesn't expire, and that the lessons he called old school were about to become the only thing standing between him and ruin. I didn't answer Ethan right away, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I knew how I said it mattered more than the words themselves. I took the phone from his hand and set it face down on the counter. First, I said calmly, we slow this down? He laughed weakly. Dad, everything's on fire, and panicking only spreads it, I replied. Sit. He sat. That alone told me how far things had gone. Ethan had never been one to sit still when he thought he could outthink a problem. Now he was frozen, eyes darting, breathing shallow. Tell me exactly what you signed, I said. He ran a hand through his hair. The CEO said it was standard, temporary, just to reassure the lender. He said everyone did it. Did you read it? Not closely. I nodded, filing that away without judgment. Shame shuts people down. Clarity opens them up. Get me the documents, I said. We spent the next hour pulling everything together, emails, contracts, PDFs, buried 3 folders deep. As I read, a familiar pattern emerged. Overpromising, vague language. Clauses that looked harmless until you actually understood them. This, I said, tapping a paragraph, isn't a guarantee. It's a trap. Ethan leaned in. What does it mean? It means the loan wasn't tied to the company, I explained. It was tied to you. When they folded, the debt didn't disappear. It transferred. His face drained of color. So I'm personally liable. Yes. He stood up abruptly, pacing. This can't be happening. My advisor said. Your advisor doesn't lose sleep if you lose your house, I said evenly. He stopped pacing. I softened my tone. I'm not here to scold you. I'm here to help you survive this. He nodded slowly. Okay, what do we do? That was the moment, the pivot. We start with what we control, I said, and we protect what matters most. I pulled out a notebook from my jacket old habit. Pen and paper had never failed me. Rule 1, I said. Cash flow is oxygen. How long can you breathe? He told me the numbers. They weren't great, but they weren't fatal yet. Rule 2, I continued. Never negotiate from fear. You don't answer calls tonight. You don't reply to emails. You gather information. He frowned. Won't that make things worse? No, I said. It prevents you from making mistakes. I showed him how to document everything. How to stop automatic withdrawals. How to put a temporary freeze on non-essential accounts. Rule 3, I said. You don't trust anyone who rushes you. He gave a bitter smile. That's basically everyone I trusted. Then consider this tuition, I said. Expensive, but educational. We worked until dawn. By the time the sun crept through the windows, the panic had receded, replaced by something steadier focus. At one point, Ethan stopped and looked at me. You've done this before, he said. I nodded. Different industry. Same mistakes. You never told me. I tried, I said gently. You just weren't ready to hear it yet. Later that morning, I made a few calls. Old contacts. People who knew how to navigate messes without exploiting them. One was a bankruptcy attorney. Another was a lender who specialized in restructuring debt not flashy, but fair. Ethan watched quietly as I spoke, listening not just to what I said, but how I said it. Calm, precise, no wasted words. When I hung up, he exhaled. How do you know who to trust? I don't, I replied. I verify. By midday, we had a plan. Not a miracle, but a path. Temporary protections. A timeline. Hard conversations ahead, but survivable ones. Ethan slumped into a chair, exhausted. I really thought being smart was enough. I sat across from him. Being smart gets you in the door. Being prepared keeps you from falling through the floor. He was quiet for a long moment. Dad, he said finally, I used to think your advice was about control, about playing it safe. And now? Now I see it's about resilience. That word landed heavy and right. As I stood to leave, he stopped me. Can you stay a few days? I nodded. Of course. As I drove home later that night to grab clothes, I thought about how close he'd come to losing everything. Not because he wasn't capable, but because he believed wisdom had an expiration date. The crisis wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But for the first time, Ethan wasn't running from the fire. He was learning how to contain it. And the old school lessons he once mocked, they were about to save him one deliberate step at a time. By the third day, the crisis had settled into a steady hum, still dangerous, still loud, but no longer screaming. Ethan moved differently now, slower, more deliberate. He listened before he spoke, asked questions before answering calls. It was a small shift, but I'd learned long ago that small shifts were how you change direction without flipping the whole car. That morning, he handed me his phone before I even asked. It's the lender, he said. They want a call today. I nodded. They can want a lot of things. He let out a short breath. I used to think ignoring calls made you look weak. No, I said. It makes you look unavailable. There's a difference. We reviewed the documents again, this time line by line. I made him explain each clause back to me in his own words. When he stumbled, we stopped. When he guessed, I corrected him. You don't negotiate what you don't understand, I said. And you don't sign what you can't explain. He rubbed his temples. I can't believe I let this slide. You can, I replied. You trusted momentum. A lot of smart people do. Around noon, the attorney I'd contacted, Marianne Klein, joined us on speakerphone. She had a calm, unhurried voice, the kind that made people feel like problems were puzzles, not disasters. I've reviewed the documents, she said. David's assessment is correct. You're exposed, but not cornered. Ethan leaned forward. What does that mean? It means you still have leverage, she replied. But only if you stop acting like you don't. She explained our options. Challenge the guarantee's enforceability. Negotiate a settlement tied to liquid assets rather than property. Buy time. Ethan listened intently, taking notes. At one point, he looked at me and shook his head slightly. You've been saying this stuff my whole life, he said quietly. About leverage. About time. I gave a small smile. Experience is just mistakes you survived. That afternoon, we finally returned the lender's call. I insisted on being present, but I didn't speak at first. This was Ethan's lesson to learn. The representative was polite but firm, urgent but vague, pressing but evasive. Ethan started to respond the way he always had, fast, accommodating, eager to sound cooperative. I held up a hand. He paused. Then he tried again, this time slower, clearer. I'm reviewing my options with counsel, he said. Any decisions will come after that. The silence on the other end was immediate. That's understood, the representative said, tone shifting. When the call ended, Ethan exhaled sharply. That felt different. It was, I said. You didn't give anything away. As the day wore on, the calls came in waves, emails, messages, voicemails, all demanding immediate responses. Each one felt less intimidating than the last, because intimidation loses power once you recognize it. That evening, we sat on the back patio, watching the sun dip behind the neighboring buildings. Ethan stared at the skyline of a city he once thought was invincible. I thought being modern meant being faster, he said, more adaptable, more flexible. And now? I asked. And now I think it just means being louder, he replied. The fundamentals didn't change. Just the packaging. I nodded. Exactly. He turned to me. Why didn't you push harder when I brushed you off? I thought about that for a moment. Because wisdom isn't something you can force feed. People have to be hungry for it. He was quiet. Later that night, as he headed to bed, he stopped in the doorway. Dad? Yeah? Thank you for not letting me crash. I corrected him gently. You still might. But now you know how to brace. The next morning brought new developments. The startup CEO had resurfaced, briefly issuing a vague statement about restructuring and unexpected market forces. It was meaningless, but it confirmed what I already suspected. They were buying time, which meant so were we. Marianne called again with updates. The lender's legal team is reconsidering their position, she said. Quietly, Ethan looked at me, eyes wide. Why? Because uncertainty cuts both ways, I said. They don't want to fight if it costs more than it gains. By the end of the week, a revised proposal came through, less aggressive, more reasonable. Still painful, but survivable. Ethan read it carefully, twice, then he looked up at me. Old school wisdom, he said, shaking his head with a rueful smile. Turns out it scales. I chuckled. It always has. The crisis wasn't over yet. There were still numbers to crunch, decisions to make, consequences to face. But something fundamental had shifted. Ethan no longer saw preparation as fear. He saw it as freedom. And for the first time in a long while, I wasn't just his father offering advice from the sidelines. I was his partner in the hard work of rebuilding. And that, more than any contract or clause, felt like the real breakthrough. The second proposal arrived late on a Friday afternoon. Ethan stood at the kitchen island staring at his laptop, jaw tight, eyes scanning the numbers again and again, as if they might rearrange themselves into something painless if he looked long enough. They're backing off, he said finally. But they're not backing out. That's expected, I replied. They're testing how serious you are. He closed the laptop slowly. I don't know if I can do this. This was the moment I'd been waiting for, not because I wanted him to doubt himself, but because doubt is where real learning begins. You don't have to like it, I said. You just have to decide. He ran both hands through his hair. I've never had to choose between bad and worse before. I leaned against the counter. Welcome to adulthood. No one advertises that part. Over the next few days, we worked through scenarios the way I always had on paper, with brutal honesty. What happens if he accepts the settlement? What happens if he pushes back? What happens if he walks away and lets it go to court? No optimism, no fear, just facts. Ethan surprised me. He didn't rush anymore. He asked better questions. He challenged assumptions, his own most of all. At one point, he stopped mid-sentence and laughed. I used to think confidence meant always having an answer, he said. Now, I think it means being okay admitting when you don't. I smiled. That realization alone probably saved you 6 figures. By Wednesday, he made his decision. He would negotiate firmly, calmly, and with limits. The call happened that afternoon. I sat nearby, not hovering, just present. When the lender tried to pressure him, Ethan didn't flinch. When they threatened escalation, he didn't panic. I understand, he said evenly. But this is my final position. There was a long pause. Then, reluctantly, they agreed to revise the terms again. When the call ended, Ethan set the phone down and stared at the ceiling. I didn't fold, he said, almost in disbelief. No, I replied. You held. That night, something unexpected happened. He apologized, not for the crisis, not for the money, but for the years before it. I thought you were scared of the world, he said quietly as we sat at the table. I didn't realize you just understood it better. I felt a lump rise in my throat, but I kept my voice steady. Understanding usually comes from falling down hard enough to remember it. He nodded slowly. I wish I'd listened sooner. So do I said. But sooner wouldn't have meant anything if you weren't ready. The next week was a blur of paperwork, calls, and careful planning. The house would be safe for now. His savings would take a hit, but not a fatal one. The debt would be painful, but manageable. Most importantly, Ethan would walk away with something far more valuable than money: perspective. On Sunday morning, as I packed my things to head home, Ethan stopped me at the door. "Dad," he said, hesitating, "can I ask you something?" "Always. Why didn't you ever say I told you so?" I paused, then answered honestly, "Because this was never about being right. It was about making sure you were okay." He swallowed hard and pulled me into a hug, awkward at first, then solid. "I get it now," he said into my shoulder. "All of it?" As I drove away, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Relief. Not because the crisis was over. It wasn't. Life never ties things up that neatly. But because my son had finally learned what wisdom really is. Not a relic of the past. Not a limitation. But a quiet advantage one that doesn't announce itself until the moment you need it most. And when that moment comes, it doesn't care how modern you think you are. It only cares whether you were prepared. A month later, the crisis no longer woke Ethan in the middle of the night. That alone told me how far he'd come. The settlement had been finalized, ugly, expensive, but contained. The townhouse stayed in his name. The debt was structured into something survivable. No lawsuits, no public fallout, no lingering threats waiting to ambush him when he least expected it. But the real change wasn't on paper. It was in him. Ethan moved with a steadiness I'd never seen before. Not the loud confidence he used to wear like armor, but a quieter kind one, built on understanding rather than assumption. He asks questions before committing. He read everything. Twice, sometimes 3 times. And for the first time in years, he called me without a problem attached. "Dad," he said one evening, "can I run something by you?" I smiled to myself. Sure, it was a small decision. A job offer from a mid-sized firm, less flashy, less glamorous, but stable. Transparent contracts. Clear expectations. A culture that valued long-term thinking over hype. I would have laughed at this offer 6 months ago, he admitted. Now it feels right, because it aligns with reality, I said. Not an illusion. He accepted the job the next day. Weeks passed. Life settled into a new rhythm. Ethan started rebuilding slowly, deliberately, without shortcuts. I watched from a distance, proud but careful not to hover. He didn't need supervision anymore. He needed trust. One afternoon, he showed up at my place unannounced. He held a small notebook in his hand. "You still write things down, right?" he asked. "Always," I said. He flipped the notebook open. I started doing it too. Plans, contingencies, worst-case scenarios. I chuckled. "Careful. You'll scare people." He grinned. "Let them be scared. I'm done being careless." We sat on the porch as the sun dipped low, the same way we used to when he was younger. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then he said something I hadn't expected. "You know what scares me the most now?" "What?" "That I almost learned this lesson too late." I nodded. "That fear will keep you sharp." He looked at me. "I used to think wisdom was about knowing more. Now I think it's about losing illusions." "That's exactly what it is," I said. Before he left, he paused at the door. "I owe you more than I can repay," he said. I shook my head. "You don't owe me anything. Just pass it on when it matters." He did. Months later, he called me laughing. "I stopped a coworker from signing something ridiculous," he said. "Used your line about incentives. Did it work?" He thanked me, Ethan said. Said no one ever explained it that way before. I leaned back in my chair, smiling. Old school wisdom doesn't shout. It waits. It lets people dismiss it, mock it, call it outdated, right up until the moment reality steps in and proves it timeless. Ethan didn't become successful because he was smarter than everyone else. He became resilient because he finally understood that preparation isn't fear. It's respect for risk, for consequence, for life as it actually is. And as for me, I didn't feel vindicated. I felt grateful. Grateful that the lesson came when it did. Grateful that my son listened before the cost became irreversible. Grateful that wisdom, once ignored, had found its moment. Because genius isn't about predicting every crisis. It's about being ready when one arrives. And sometimes, the smartest thing a parent can do is wait patiently for their child to realize that old school doesn't mean obsolete. It means proven.